We're going to get started. So last session, hopefully for the day for you guys. If it's not, I'm not sure what sessions between 5 and 6, but I hope they have beers. So we're at the end here of Wednesday. Now, the talk we're going to go through, we change this title every year, mostly because we're indecisive, but the other reason is when we typically go through a conversation on threat prevention and WildFire, we talk about really what the last year has looked like since last Ignite, so since last Ignite in Vancouver. We decided to change it up this year in a few different areas, and in the area of threat, the route that we wanted to go was not just to, still good? Not just to talk about some of the features that we implemented, but why we decided to implement them and the problem that we were aiming to solve. And so that you could also hear it from a security researcher's mouth. So my name is Garrett Hamilton. I'm a product manager here at Alto Networks, and we decided to bring a researcher along. His name is Curtis.
Hi, I'm Curtis Carmody. I'm a principal security researcher, and I've been working on WildFire for about 3 years now.
Now, I've heard in a lot of these presentations, there's been a question of how many of you are new to Ignite and how many of you are new to Palo Alto Networks. I'm not going to do that. But what we are going to start with is a little bit of a precursor into what the threat and WildFire ecosystem looks like. So me being the product manager of WildFire, I've inherently put WildFire right in the center of this slide. All eyes on WildFire. But really at the end of the day, the intention of doing this is to point out that every single enforcement point from Palo Alto Networks, whether it be firewall, traps, Aperture, and also all of our partnerships and those that are to be added with the application framework, are funneling some information to WildFire. And WildFire's whole intention is really twofold. One, be able to detect something with accuracy. Hopefully, in the case of detecting something malicious, gain that right, especially. And then secondly, generating high fidelity information that then can be pushed down in the form of protections to our customers' enforcement points or other integrated products. And so as we do that push down, as we do that sharing model, we're sharing that with other products like ThreatAV, subscriptions, and URL filtering subscriptions that you have in the firewall. And we're also sharing that again with all of our partnerships. So just starting with that idea, because what we're going to cover today will cover all of these different products in some way, shape, or form for you. Now, as part of the growth in terms of what we're seeing, Lee did this slide in his keynote talk, and there's a lot of reasons why it's beneficial, and big data is great, but really for us, it's the difference between where we started 7 years ago with only supporting PE files and getting you protections maybe every 24 hours to now where we are today, which is supporting 4 different operating systems, multiple different file types, and supporting many different other integrations besides just the firewalls themselves. And that is one of the reasons why we've seen this hockey stick in growth from a file ingestion standpoint and a samples per month standpoint, so much so that the difference between Vancouver last year and today is more than 2 billion files. If you think about that, that's almost half in just 1 year. And as we continue to add more customers and more enforcement points, we continue to see more data. And I think one of the other areas that's really useful is talking about the research standpoint, right, and what you have access to when you're building features.
Right. Having data of this size from diverse organizations all over the world really lets us detect and see emerging trends and threats as they happen. It really helps us to maintain an ongoing sense of what malware looks like today. And this is important because we can quickly see what new detection methods are needed. We can develop these methods and evaluate them quickly. And in machine learning, there's this notion that your model is only as good as your data. And as we increase the use of machine learning and WildFire, having this data is really essential. So the way that WildFire approaches malware classification is a combination of static and dynamic analysis. And I think that the best approach will always combine these 2 techniques. So static analysis is great at identifying malware that looks like malware that you've seen before. We're basically only looking at the file without opening it or running it. But there will always be malware that you've never seen. There's always going to be new exploits. There's always going to be targeted attacks. And that's why we use dynamic analysis. So in dynamic analysis, we're basically taking the file, we're running it if it's an executable, or we're opening it with an application if it's a document, and we're just watching to see what happens, right? And a well-designed sandbox should detonate any malicious file. There are cases where a sample can detect that it's being analyzed. And then there are cases where we have basically 30 years of Windows malware, but only a subset of that is going to run on a modern operating system. So that's when we pivot back to static analysis. And usually that helps us cover those cases, but not always. And that's when we develop some of these more advanced techniques.
Right, and if we think about it from the life of a file being analyzed, a sample is going to pass through these different analysis capabilities. And if you think about those items underneath the circles, those are really modules of how we're going to detect threats. But the key point is that while static analysis can detect things within seconds and variants of attacks, dynamic analysis is always going to be producing that, as I mentioned, high fidelity information that's going to feed into their products. Because while I can scrape out things statically, say out of a binary to find hard-coded IPs or URLs, it's really what happens when I can run that sample and what it's connecting to. Is it using a different algorithm to connect to different DGAs, right? Different domains? Like, what is it using? I can only get that data once I have it live. And it turns out that we spent a lot of time investing research into building our own custom hypervisor, something we talked about last year. So a couple notes on that. If you weren't aware, we have our own custom hypervisor. It's not QEMU or Hyper-V like some of the other vendors in the space. What it's really focused on is a purpose-built environment where researchers like Curtis can develop new modules, hooks, and other implementations to actually sit in a better state in the host opposed to the guest. And any of you that are familiar with hypervisors know that is a definitive advantage when you're trying to manipulate information within the environment. But even with that said, even when we can do things like push the temperature from the host to the guest, which other hypervisors can't, there are still ways to fingerprint a hypervisor, or excuse me, fingerprint a guest and evade the sandbox. And that's why we implemented bare metal analysis. And originally we implemented bare metal analysis the idea came about 4 years ago to help us detect these advanced threats, to help us actually, at scale, analyze samples in physical hardware. So these are laptops, NUCs, desktops, sitting in data centers. It's a complete pain in the ass to manage. DevOps hates it. We can blow through a NUC, as an example, in less than 2 weeks if it processes about 4,000 samples. And what ends up happening here is we get a real-world expectation of how a sample would want to be analyzed on a physical piece of hardware. No trickery, no games, actual hardware. And that provides feedback to researchers like Curtis to tell them, hey, develop better features so we can be better at detection. But also it automates that process of giving you feedback as a customer that if we got something wrong, telling you we got it wrong and giving you that context of why. So the topics that we're going to cover today, as I mentioned, is a little bit different than just going a feature marathon and talking about what we've done in the past year. We're going to talk about a few specific areas that our customers constantly bring up. Some old. I think all of us have been dealing with malware that has been delivered through some kind of macro method inside of a document. And some that may be a little bit more new that tie into why machine learning might not just be that silver bullet and how you can obfuscate your attack to bypass those techniques. And then we'll talk in the middle there about different coverage we're implementing across operating systems, protocols, and why that's important. And again, the key here is not only, hey, we did this feature and we think it's really cool, but how we did it, a little bit in the weeds on why we did it that way, and then the outcomes for you.
So as Garrett mentioned, Office macros of old, they've basically been around forever, and I don't think they're going away anytime soon. Originally, Office macros were used in malware that was mostly harmless compared to what we see today. It basically would copy themselves into every new document created by Word or Excel. They would print cutesy messages at certain times of day, send emails, like worms like that. But since then, malware authors have really come to realize the full potential of VBA. So VBA is able to use the full Windows API, which basically means that it can do anything an executable can do. Malware authors usually limit themselves, though, to using VBA as a first-stage downloader. And the downloaders basically do one thing, which is connect to the internet, download an executable, and then run it. Right. The other thing that's dangerous about VBA is that it's distributed on every version of Office today. So unless an organization has globally disabled VBA through a policy, you're always one user click away from running untrusted code on your network. So what we're seeing today, most often with VBA malware in these downloaders, is that they're programmatically generated. So basically, they're tool sets sold in the black market. You input a URL, and it just spits out tens or hundreds of thousands of documents that all have different hashes that are sent to everyone all over the world with the intent that some percentage of them will download your second stage binary. And because these documents are programmatically generated, we've basically seen a failure of the existing signature-based techniques to classify these files.
And when Curtis first we were talking about this in the presentation. By the way, anybody know what this is? So this is how AV vendors generate signatures for all those hundreds of thousands of macros. No, this is actually a LAN party in Europe, and if you've never been to a LAN party, you definitely missed out on life. But when I started thinking about this conceptually, a lot of eyes on glass, a lot of people having to sit down together and go through these thousands and thousands and thousands of macro-based attacks. And back 20, 30 years ago, it was not thousands or tens of thousands, right? It was 1s, 2s, 3s, hundreds. I think you used the example of cutesy types attacks. And so I think that approach had to change, right? As this was able to scale and toolkits were easier to manipulate, that approach had to change.
Yeah, so we've tried to come up with a new approach which is scalable and better anticipates new attacks. So basically what we're doing now is we extract all of the VBA in a document, analyze it together. We take this VBA and put it into a Vba Analysis engine which we've created. So the cornerstone of this Vba Analysis engine is a custom VBA parser we've built. This parser can extract rich features from VBA, such as the functions that execute automatically, functions that execute as a result of user events, if there's Windows APIs that are registered and executed, if the VBA is self-modifying, stuff like that. So we extract all of these features, and then we feed them into a random forests model, which we've trained against a large corpus of benign and malicious VBA. So now we have a verdict for the VBA. But we see the same VBA in many different documents, and sometimes in different documents of different formats. For example, Office has these OLE files in OOXML, like the .doc and .docm. We see the same VBA in these files, so we want to be able to tell, is this the same VBA regardless of format? So to do that, what we've designed is a format-agnostic VBA hashing algorithm. And combined the VBA verdict with the hash, we're able to work with products like Traps, who now locally can compute the VBA hash, query WildFire for that hash, and very quickly tell if the VBA is known benign or malicious. So this lets us do two things. First, Traps does not have to submit the entire document to know if the VBA is benign or malicious, which protects user privacy. The second thing is we're able now to collect these global stats about what malware we're seeing in the world today and trends moving forward.
Yeah, and I think on point number 2, it really comes down to what kind of coverage we're able to provide our customers as well, and that correlation that Curtis and other researchers are able to benefit from. So this is an example of the type of outcomes that we're able to produce from one signature or one protection for a macro-based attack. So as you can tell here on the left-hand side, you have something like TrickBot. One of our pieces of coverage that you can go on ThreatVault and look into blocks tens of thousands of different macro-based attacks. That's beneficial for you as a customer leveraging the firewall, but especially beneficial for an endpoint technology that is basically seeing document after document after document sitting there to really pick out the bad and provide that coverage from not only that upload and privacy standpoint, but just from a security, I'll use the air quotes here, zero-day threat perspective. And when we talk a lot about coverage of a file type, I think that's where a lot of our customers like to be as a starting point. You know, do you have this file type coverage? Do you have that file type coverage? But when it comes back to thinking about it from the grander scale, it's really what type of coverage do our customers need to provide inspection, detection, and protection in those environments. And one of those areas that continues to come up, not because we all like to say IoT at this point, I'm sure everybody's tired of it, but because it continues to be this mystical unicorn that nobody can quite figure out. When we think about securing Linux-based devices, we think about IoT, which is still up in the air, and we think a lot about our Linux server environments for our customers, which I think a lot of customers, when we talk, they've just kind of given up or just forgotten about them or just want to put a firewall in place, and that's great, but at the end of the day, it is in many ways the keys to the castle. And so from a coverage standpoint, when we approached Linux, we wanted to approach from those two kind of pillars. And the reasons being is that a lot of these IoT devices actually run some kind of Linux distribution, right? And that's what makes them so terrifying, is that if I can program something openly available to the web that's running a Linux distribution, I can probably run an ELF binary on it, and I can go ahead and have it run my code. And I probably gave it default password admin password 1, and it totally worked out. On the opposite side with Linux servers, I can use that same type of attack to take advantage of a more broad set of infrastructure, to move laterally within that infrastructure, to take advantage of the file systems. I was just having a conversation with a customer about a typical crypto wall attack, and I said, have you checked out crypto mining? We'll get into that in a second. And all of this essentially is leading to breaches of some capacity. And so the way that we analyze, or the way that we approach analysis of Linux files, say ELF binaries, for example, is we still use the traditional methods, static analysis, dynamic analysis that Curtis had touched on, right? Analyzing files to find variants and then finding unique data out of that dynamic analysis environment. But we've also introduced something called honeypot. Now, full kind of disclosure here, we're not selling you a honeypot. We're not going to install a honeypot for you. If you have your own honeypot, that's great. We can talk after about what ours does. But it's a honeypot for our researchers to actually be able to create a mock environment of tens of different IoT devices all at once. And how we interface with that honeypot is we run the binaries in a Linux-based environment, say a Debian distro as an example. But we know that those binaries are not always going to be targeted for a full-scale Linux distro as an example. So what we do is we start to route a lot of the traffic and a lot of the interactions out of that analysis environment and basically push it through these mock interfaces out to the web. And then we wait, and we make it available, and we see who is running some scanner, who is looking to try to exploit a vulnerability or try to take advantage of an IoT device, and then we allow them to interface with that information and start to give us feedback. So sometimes that feedback is an attacker giving us default creds, treating us like a default router, a default creds for a DVR. Other times, we actually get a lot more from the attack. So it's allowing us flexibility to do things, as an example, of taking advantage of a publicly available exploit. So struts, it's available in your Metasploit distribution or Kali Linux. Anybody can use it on the web. So just a heads up if you're interested in doing that. They try to attack our system. They leverage an exploit. They send us a bunch of commands, right? Because now we're looking like many different environments, so our hit rate's a lot higher to gain those commands. Then we get their inputs, what objects they wanted to send us, and allows us to build a much more holistic set of data for our customers versus something that may just say, hey, this is bad. And in these examples, we talked about the coin miner family. There's actually a talk, I think, next to me about this. Attackers are no longer having to get in your face about generating revenue from you as a victim, right? So ransomware is still popular. It's disruptive. There's no doubt about it. It's widely used. But coin miners are becoming more and more of a fad, particularly in higher education and high tech, because if they can leverage common exploits to get in and do something not nearly as nefarious as completely locking your systems, they can take advantage of all those open resources, all those available resources across your data center to mine cryptocurrency, which if I can get a botnet to the size of the Dyn DNS attack to do that, with Mirai, I can probably generate a botnet to do crypto mining and get rich pretty quick. So the attackers are getting smarter. They're saying, can I do things more discreetly? And as you can tell, that number, by the way, from Autofocus is not a joke. The amount of crypto mining samples we're seeing across the board is just getting out of control. And now a whole different attack vector, which we didn't talk about too much here, it's independent of Linux. You can go to through your browser to a web page, and they'll use JS or JavaScript to actually use resources on your machine. In fact, if you use Pirate Bay, it already happened to you. They might have warned you, but it already happened to you if you used Pirate Bay before. So continues to be an interesting space, and we're seeing a migration from things like typical botnets and those full-fledged DDoS attacks to using things like a crypto mining infrastructure, and well beyond that, looking at how might attackers start to do data exfiltration, which is something we're really scared about, right?
So not all of the attacks that we see are subdued like Eric was talking about. We still see these like large-scale, in-your-face, international news-making attacks every year. This year, the ones that we really saw were driven by these SMB exploits. So starting with the shadow brokers dump, the world received all of these great NSA 0 days. And it didn't take long for malware authors to turn these into large-scale, successful campaigns. So basically what they're doing, which is genius, which we haven't seen too often in the past, is they're using these exploits to not only get into an organization through an external SMB server, but once they're inside of an organization, they're using SMB to move laterally. So basically, unless you have a firewall between all of your machines, if your machines aren't patched, et cetera, these things are just exploding inside of your network. And this is why they had such a large impact. So the authors of these penetration testing tools, like Metasploit, they want to make an impact too. So anytime something like this happens, the first thing they do is copy all of that into their toolkits. So now your white hats are also going to be using these exploits. And anytime you let anybody probe your network, you really have to make sure that your Windows versions are up to date, you're using the best protocols, et cetera.
Yeah, and kind of to touch a little bit more on that, when we think about, as a company, we always want to protect you from the real threats, right? The real world attacks, and that's really important to everybody in this room, but you also might have a red team. You also might have to do an annual pen test because your company says you have to. And it turns out that you get a lot of flack from those pen testers when they know to inspect or dive into those specific protocols that they know you're not looking at. They know they're a pain in the ass. They know that SMB is, from an inspection standpoint, is a disaster. They know you only really care because it transfers files to and fro. But at the end of the day, attacks like this that then make their way into publicly available products are just as much of a threat, whether it be real world or it be through a pen testing team. And when we talk about the coverage of how Palo Alto Networks wants to stop that attack, we start with PAN-OS, right? So what can we do? Everything we talked about today is really being done in the cloud for you. If you are using the latest content, you're using PAN-OS firewalls, you're using different integration products, you can leverage those capabilities. It's all done for you, no upgrade required in those areas. Now, of course, with ELF binaries as an example, you have to be running 8.0. So just a heads up if you got to get to that level. But with 8.1, we rolled out SMB support. And we roll it out in a few different ways. So you notice I have a list of SMB protocols there. I won't ask the audience to raise their hands, but I will say that if you're running SMB v1, just look at me right now. OK, I'm just kidding. But please get rid of it. In fact, Microsoft has a huge campaign right now to get you off SMB v1. But we broke it down into these different areas because as part of our best practices, if you saw John Harrison's talk, you don't need to allow all of these different versions of this protocol, right? You can choose the one that works for you, and hopefully you have an opportunity to make that decision. But we also want to be able to support inspection on those different versions as well. So what will happen now is anywhere where you have a PAN-OS firewall and SMB traffic running through that firewall, running 8.1, we'll be able to do inspection, detection, and prevention. That means that we'll be able to stop attacks that we know about, submit files that are unknown up to the cloud for analysis and generate protections and push those back down to stop attacks on that protocol. And these are just a few examples from ThreatAV. So if you go into Threat Vault and you look up any of those IDs, or you look up that sample, that's your payload example. So Petya, obviously very popular, movie star malware, great, everybody knows about it. And then all the, well not all, but some of the RCEs, right? So some of the remote code execution exploits for those vulnerabilities related to what Curtis had touched on. And if you take a look in autofocus, we can break down any of this information for you into the specific tag and file type, and we tell you what it means to your network. If you don't run SMB, which I'm guessing is rare, but if you don't, that's great. But if you do, here are the different attacks that might be appropriate, and you can even find out if it was something that impacted you. Now, switching gears to PanDB, our URL filtering, because we want to be able to cover that whole kind of ecosystem of products. We talk about PanDB, there's a lot of new ways that we've shifted over the past 3 or 4 years from being a URL categorization product that tells you home and garden, gambling, porn, a few other things, all the way up to now malware classification, phishing classification, and now C2 classification or command and control classification. The reason these categories are important is because they should get your mind thinking about different ways to operationalize security within your network. So as an example, if I'm a user and I click on a URL and my GET request goes out to the web, or it attempts to, and the firewall is sitting there, and I block it, and I say, this is malware, you're like, hey, great, Palo Alto Networks got it. Hopefully you're preventing and not just alerting, but hey, we got it, awesome. Same thing with phishing. And phishing actually provides you, since we handle that request, phishing actually provides you a lot of different capabilities. So I can stop that, put up a phishing page with your face on and say, right? Don't go to this website. That was a phishing page. try again. On the other side of this, we have command and control. And if anybody's familiar with the attack lifecycle that we use, because we can't use the real one because it's trademarked and you have to pay for it, the attack lifecycle goes through multiple different phases. When we use a malware or a phishing category, we're really stopping that exploitation or that delivery of the payload phase. But if we talk about command and control, that's another step in that attack lifecycle. That's the step that says, hey, something inside your network is trying to beacon out to a malicious website, which is generally an indicator that something executed on that machine, or your user for some reason has a bunch of command and control domains that they're trying to reach. That one's less likely. But at the end of the day, your workflow for how you respond to that might be, crap, command and control. That's happening inside of my environment. My URL filtering is catching it. I probably need to find out what's going on with that machine so that I can either remediate it or maybe make a different decision on why that user might be doing that. But it's different operations depending on how you work with that product. And again, this is available to you. All was done on the back end through content updates, so it's something that you can start to use if you're not already leveraging it already. Now, I was going to put a picture of myself up here, but I hear that we give these slides out to a few people, so I just grabbed a random frustrated person. But this is what I look like driving down the 101 from San Francisco to Santa Clara every day into the office. Not just because I'm stuck in traffic, but because by the 19th billboard that has machine learning on it, I've about given up on companies in general. One more thing before I step off my soapbox. If you have a company and your company puts machine learning and then your name's smaller than machine learning on the billboard, you got to go work for a new company or start a new company. It's too much for me at least. So one of the ideas with machine learning is that Nir's up on stage and tells you about all the problems that's solving, and that's great. And the more data we get and the more accurate data that we get, the better off all of us are going to be at our jobs in determining that in 3 years our health insurance will be this because we're not going to be sick. All the different things that we can leverage to get better data, better outcomes for us as customers of different businesses. But real data and accurate data is important. And in security, we're battling an adversary that wants to get past us, right? That wants to defeat us, wants to give us bad data and trick us and be able to bypass our capabilities. So machine learning can't be that silver bullet all by itself. And so we want to talk a little bit more about what attackers are doing to get around machine learning and why that's not going to be the silver bullet that stops every single thing.
So the way that most malware authors obfuscate executables, at least on Windows, is by packing them. So packing is basically the process of taking an executable, compressing and or encrypting it, packing it, and then turning it into a new executable which has this packed payload along with code which can reverse the process. When this new packed executable is run, it doesn't change the behavior of the original sample. It just decompresses, decrypts it, and then runs that original file. But this really thwarts static analysis, in particular machine learning, because there's not much information left in a packed file. The other issue is that benign files are also often packed. There's legitimate use cases for packing a file. For example, you can decrease the size of an executable. Some companies think that it'll help them protect their intellectual property, et cetera. So as far as machine learning is concerned, like we're putting garbage data in, we're going to get garbage out. So we need to unpack these files before we can pull any sort of useful information out of them. And while it's true there is like a lot of popular packers, and there's a lot of tools that can unpack these popular files, it doesn't work all the time. It's trivial for a malware author to break a packer, to tweak it, or to just make their own. So the only foolproof way to unpack these files is using dynamic analysis. Very good. So this is what we're trying to do now in WildFire. So if any of you are malware analysts, I'm sure you've done this before, either using IDAPRO's plugin or by hand. But basically, you have an unpacker stub. It's going to just run around in a loop, unpack the packed code into memory, into new memory segments, and then at some point, it's going to just jump to that new code. So what we're doing with WildFire is we're monitoring the creation of those memory segments, looking for memory segments that become writable at some point, become executable at some point, receive data, and then are executed. During dynamic analysis, we gather these segments, and afterwards, we try to reassemble them into what we think the original file looked like. Maybe it's not exactly the original file, but there should still be enough useful information to us that we can make a better determination using static analysis. So at this point, with this recomposed file, machine learning actually has a fighting chance at differentiating a benign and a malicious file.
Right, and before that, when we have that packed sample, essentially static analysis is going to rely on having X-ray vision into what's happening within that packed binary. And that X-ray vision just isn't there until you're able to really recompile and give that full picture view. One example you can take back to your CISO or whoever your boss says, what did you learn? You can think of it this way. If I walk into an airport, I'm probably not going to be profiled and think, hey, this guy has ninja stars in his bag. I don't know, ninja stars for everything that's going on right now. But once I go through that metal detector, once I put my bag on that system and that conveyor to go through and get scanned, immediately picks it up, right? Immediately has a visibility into that brown bag. And what we're passing through to machine learning classifier without unpacking a sample is just that brown bag. And if I'm going to classify something, I cannot determine it to be malicious. I don't have enough data. And it turns out that a lot of products that used machine learning on the endpoint about 2 years ago were really, really good at classifying samples as malicious just based on entropy and created a bunch of different problems. So when we recognized this issue and the challenges that we saw, even though we had dynamic analysis, it was really important to provide the machine learning capabilities and the static analysis capabilities that Curtis teams work on to give them that X-ray vision into what's happening. And that's just what we did. So truthfully, I had an extra slide here that was going to go through the topics. Kind of late in the game, sorry guys. But basically just to review, entertain me here. To review the different topics that we covered, something everybody knows about, macro-based attacks. Hopefully next year, we're talking to you about Microsoft enabling custom JS in Excel and what attack vectors that's opened up. If you guys weren't excited for that feature, I don't know who was. We're really excited because that just means we're going to be in business forever. Thank you, Microsoft. On the flip side, we talked about supporting operating systems like Linux and what that means to us, and we'd love to get your feedback maybe after this talk on whether or not that really meets your needs and what you're seeing. Met with some customers this week talking about ICS systems and what IoT looks like for them and how just with a little bit of effort and things not working out correctly, there's enough air pressure in a data center to blow out a wall 1 foot. So there's a lot of different challenges in that space. And of course, I think one of the most interesting areas and things that we get most excited about is the malware obfuscation, because that really talks about what attackers are doing to bypass all these methods that people are constantly talking about in the news and on billboards, driving on the 101, and all these different areas. And so for us, we continue to try to make our design of how we detect and analyze malware in a modular sense. One, to be able to use a lot of tools that Curtis's team is able to build quickly, but also to make it easier for us to stop threats right when we start to identify a trend. So thank you all for coming. We have, I think, about 10 minutes or so. We can open it up to any questions, and we'll just kind of get started. Is that good? All right. Or that bad. I don't know which one it was. No. OK. Well, we'll be up here for the remainder of the time if you actually want to come up and ask us a question in person. Thank you. Thanks.